It is good to see you guys this morning. It's the 5th week of our series. We're calling the series 10. It's a series on the 10 Commandments. But what we're learning is that there's a principle, is a relationship principle behind each one of these commandments can take us deeper into our relationship with God and deeper into our relationship with one another. And you may remember the very first week, we talked about in the New Testament, one day Jesus was going around teaching, and the religious leaders came up to him and said, "Hey, Jesus, could you sum up the law?" Or basically sum up the 10 Commandments. And this is what he said. He said, well, love the Lord God with all your heart. And then he said, love your neighbor as yourself. So love God and love others. And if you look at the 10 Commandments, they're actually broken down into 2 sections. The first 4 commandments have to do with loving God. They're vertical in nature. The last 6 commandments have to do with how we treat and love each other. They're horizontal in nature. And it's really interesting, if you look at some of the priests and the worship under the law, they actually had one offering that they made to God that was known as a heave offering. And they had an offering that they made to God that was known as a wave offering. And so when they were worshiping God and it was the relationship with God, they would do this because it was about the vertical. But when a law pertained to a neighbor, a loved one, a family member, it was horizontal in nature. And so Jesus just talked about goes all the way back to the book of Exodus, all the way back to Leviticus. So we've come to this 5th commandment, and the principle behind the commandment is the principle of honor. Let me just show you the commandment. It's found in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. Honor your father and mother. So let me ask you a question. Why would God put honoring your parents as one of the big 10? You ever thought about that? I mean, think of all the important things that God could have put in the top 10. These are like the 10 most important things to him. Why would God put honor your father and mother? And then think about it this way. God knew going in that there were going to be a lot of horrible parents. He knew going in that there was going to be a lot of broken parents who were going to pass their brokenness onto their kids. So why would he include that? And if he could only get 10 in, why didn't like I've said before, I think the number one sin that we struggle with as Christians is pride. And I am working on a series on pride. Maybe we'll address it this summer. Why didn't he put thou shalt not be prideful? Or thou shalt not be greedy? But then he comes along and he says, I want you to honor your father and your mother. Why would God do that? It's because, see, God knew that the consequences of not honoring the authority that he has placed in your life, the consequences of that only get more and more severe as you get older. And so I think God thought, you know what? We better address this when people are young. We're going to have them honor their mother and their father. Have you ever heard someone say, nobody's going to tell me what to do? Right? Isn't it amazing how those individuals either end up in the military or in jail? Where their whole life is somebody telling them what to do, right? But we know a lot of people like that. You know why they're like that? They never understood the principle of honoring their parents. So we're going to talk about, understand God's doing this for our good. He's basically teaching this, and you're going to see it this weekend. If you want to live a happy life, if you want to live a fulfilling life, then we have to understand the principle of honor. So let's look at the commandment again, Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, honor your father and mother. Now let's be honest, right up front, that assumes a lot. First of all, it assumes you know your parents. And I know that there are people in this room, people that will be here this weekend, people who will be watching online, they don't even know who their birth parent was. But it assumes that you know your parents. It also assumes that we're in the kind of relationship with our parents that we can actually honor them. But I want you to understand going in, God understands all that. He understands the brokenness of this world. He understands the fallenness. He understands that some parents aren't Christians. They don't even apply biblical principles in the relationship. God understands that some of you are coming from painful backgrounds. He understands that in your relationship with your parents, some of you have been hurt, some of you have been abused, some of you have been taken advantage of. I know some people, just the mention of their mom or just the mention of their dad just brings up all kinds of negative emotions. But I got to be honest with you, and I have studied this from the beginning of Genesis to the end of Revelation. I got to tell you up front, I can't find any exemption for obeying this commandment. I can't find anywhere it says, I'm the exception, I get a pass on this one. And so it doesn't matter what your parents have done, it doesn't matter how awful your parents may have been. God comes along and says, one of my top 10 is you got to honor them. Now, let me just say this. If you're already a little nervous and getting a little PTSD this morning, let me just let you know if you've been through abuse, if you've experienced pain at the hand of your parents, we are going to talk about this weekend. How do you find healing? How do you finally move past that? And so don't check out. Now, I want to begin by pointing out some benefits of just honoring our parents. And there's some really good benefits here, so hang on to it. Here's the first one, longevity. A longer life. Look what it says, Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. Honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land, that would be the promised land, the Lord your God is giving you. So the very first commandment is, if you honor your parents, you are going to live a longer life. I remember one comedian used to say, you know what, I brought you into this world and I can take you out. You know, maybe that's why you live longer, right? But it's the promise of longevity. But the second benefit explains why obeying this commandment actually results in longevity. The second benefit of honoring your parents is stability. Now let me show you how longevity and stability, how they tie together. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16. I told you that the 10 Commandments appear 3 different times in the Bible. The second time they appear is in Deuteronomy chapter 5. The first time is in Exodus chapter 20. This is right after the Hebrew people have come out of bondage in Egypt. But remember, Moses gives them the 10 Commandments. They eventually make it to the promised land, but they decide not to go in. Remember that they see the fortified cities, the giants, they don't want to go in. So God says, I'm going to give you 40 years to think about it. So they wander around the wilderness for 40 years. They've learned their lesson. A whole generation has died off. And now God brings them back to the promised land. But right before they go in, they're settled there, right on the other side of the Jordan River. All they have to do is cross the Jordan River at Kadesh Barnea, and they will be in the promised land. But Moses says, before we go in, let me remind you of what we talked about 40 years ago. So he gives what is known as the second law. In fact, Deuteronomy means second law. So this is what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16. It says, honor your father and mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live long. Now notice this, and that it may go well with you. So that you may live long, and so that it may go well with you. By the way, this is the first commandment that comes with a promise. And the promise isn't just that you're going to live longer. The promise is if you obey your parents, if you honor your parents, life is going to go well for you. And I don't mean to be sarcastic, but who really wants to live a long life if it's not going well for you, right? By the way, have you ever noticed that you can have a home, you can have a family, you can have 2 kids from the same family, they grew up with the same parents, they grew up with the same rules, they grew up with the same boundaries, and for one, life goes well. And for the other kid who grew up in the exact same home with the same parents, the same rules, and the same boundaries, their life is an absolute train wreck. Why is that? Well, I can tell you right now, I can almost guarantee you this 100%, that it's because the one whose life was a train wreck somewhere early on missed this principle of honoring their parents. Now, let me just show you some verses that back this up. And this is just going to be one of those that's going to make you a little uncomfortable today, and that's good. Nothing wrong with that, okay? Romans chapter 13, verse 1 says this, let everyone be subject to governing authorities. In other words, what Paul is telling us here is that God has put people in our lives who are going to be over us, and we're to be subject to them. In other words, the reason we have to learn to honor our parents is because through our whole life, there are going to be people that God has placed over us that we have to honor also. But what I want you to notice is this word subject. Let everyone be subject to the governing authority. It's interesting, if you could study the Greek language, most of the Greek words, especially the Greek verbs, come from either a sporting background or a military background. This word subject comes from a military background. This is what the word means, to submit to without any question. To submit to without any question. Why is that important? Well, it's important because if you're in the military, not only your life, but the life of those who are serving with you in the military, you know what it depends on? It depends on you following orders. And so what he's saying is that we are to submit to those in our life that God has placed in authority over us. Who would that be? Parents, teachers, law enforcement, mayors. Don't let it go to your head, Jacques, okay? All kinds of people. If they're in authority over us, God says they're there. In fact, it says there's no authority that's been established that wasn't established by me. So we're going to have to honor that authority. By the way, the only exception to this rule is when someone in authority asks us to do something that doesn't line up with the Bible. Other than that, we're to honor them. Look, in fact, let me show it to you. Romans 13, verse 1. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. By the way, when Paul wrote this to the people in Rome, guess who the emperor was? Nero. You know what Nero did? he tortured Christians. He burned Christians at the stake. In fact, he used to burn Christians at the stake in his garden for his parties. Also, he was known for taking Christians, wrapping them in animal skins, soaking the animal skins, wrapping the Christians tightly, putting them on a pole, and then as the skins dried, they shrunk, and they literally suffocated the life out of the Christians. That's in charge. That's who's in charge. And Paul writes, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. For there is, look at this, no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, now this is the important part, whoever rebels against the authority, that would be parents, is rebelling against God, against what God has instructed and instituted. And here's the key phrase, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. So he's telling us, if we rebel against the people that God has put in authority over our life, we're going to be judged. Life's going to be hard. It's not going to go well. Now, let me just show you some verses that bear this out as it relates to this commandment of honoring your parents. Exodus 21, verse 15. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Any questions? Right? That's pretty simple, right? Aren't you glad we don't live under the law anymore? Here's another one. Exodus 21, verse 17. Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. We would all be dead, right? Proverbs 20:20, if someone curses their father or mother, their lamp will be snuffed out in pitch darkness. I think you know what that's saying, right? By the way, there are two passages in the New Testament, and in these two passages, it lists the kinds of people that are under the judgment of God. Romans chapter 1, verse 30, here's the list. Slanderers, God haters, insolent means people who are rude. Oh dear, everybody in New York gone, right? Arrogant, boastful. Now notice this. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. Here's the other one, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents. So there's only two lists, and being disobedient to your parents, it appears in both of the lists. So those who resist authority, Paul says, you're going to bring judgment on yourself. Now I'm going to show you an interesting passage from the Old Testament. And I have never taught on this passage in my life, but it's talking about a generation that doesn't honor its mother and its father. It could be any generation. I think it may especially apply to this generation, and I'll show you why. But what's interesting is this. The passage I'm going to show you out of Proverbs, it begins with not honoring your father and your mother. And it ends with not honoring your father and mother. But in the middle, there are these two verses that make no sense whatsoever. In fact, if you had a commentary at home on Proverbs and you looked it up, you would find out that most commentators have no idea why Solomon placed these two verses right in the middle of these verses that are talking about people who don't honor their mother and father. I'm going to show you why. Okay, let me show you what these two verses, and you'll say, I'm going to read it and it sounds like they don't fit. They fit perfectly. Let me just read it to you. Proverbs 30, verse 11. There are those who curse their fathers and do not bless their mothers. Now notice how it describes them. Those who are pure in their own eyes and yet are not cleansed of their filth. In other words, they kind of see themselves as better than everybody else. Those whose eyes are ever so haughty, whose glances are disdainful. Okay, kids, that's when you roll your eyes at your parents, okay? Verse 14, those whose teeth are swords and whose jaws are set with knives to devour the poor from the earth and the needy from among mankind. This is basically talking about ruthless language, hate speech, vindictiveness. Now, here's the verses that don't seem to fit. The leech has two daughters. Give, they cry. There are three things that are never satisfied, four that never say enough. The grave, the barren womb, land, which is never satisfied with water, and fire, which never says enough. Now, notice how Solomon wraps it all up. The eye that mocks a father, that scorns an aged mother, will be pecked out by the ravens of the valley, will be eaten by the vultures, okay? I think that's figuratively, but what is he talking about here? Well, again, it starts with not honoring your mother and father. It ends with not honoring your mother and father. And then Solomon says, right in the middle of this passage, he says, let me tell you something unique about this generation. He says, they're a generation of entitlement. They say, give, more. I want, I deserve. I deserve to have my student loans paid off. I deserve that, right? They're like leeches. Solomon says they just suck the blood out of you. They just suck the life out of you, and they never seem to have enough. They're never satisfied. But why? Why are they never satisfied? Solomon is saying it's because they didn't grow up with this principle of honor. Now, I'm just using this because I'm telling you the consequence of not honoring your mother and father, and then eventually not honoring other authorities that God puts in your life. It is severe. I'll just tell you, and sometimes you just have to talk about current events. When I watch the video of these college kids, what's really interesting to me is when they read their demands. And I'm thinking, who are you to have demands? I'll tell you where it comes from. It's a generation of entitlement. It's a generation of participation trophy. It's a generation, we get our way. We're going to get our way, and we're not going to leave until we get our way. By the way, let me just say this. Do you know the very first thing that Hitler did when he wanted to turn Germany into what I'm saying is probably the most evil nation that has ever existed? You know what he did? He went after the kids. Study your history. Do you know what he taught them? He said, listen, if your parents disagree with the Nazi party, turn them in. And that's what the kids did. But my point is, he went after the kids. He taught them to dishonor their mother and father. And I'll just tell you, what we're witnessing in our culture today is an indoctrination and a radicalization of a generation. But what I want you young people to know is you gotta think for yourself. You gotta look into the truth of God's word, because consequences of not obeying the fifth commandment are severe. By the way, let me just say something. This is a little side note. Last week, I'm on a little bit of a roll here. Last week, I mentioned something about abortion, and as someone was leaving, they said, "Oh, well, Mike, your emails are gonna light up this week." By the way, they didn't. But they said, I said, well, why is that? They said, because it's such a political issue. And I said, no. This is where we've gotten it wrong. Abortion is not a political issue. Abortion is a biblical issue. And biblical issues become political issues when Christians stay silent. We stop being salt and light. And so all of a sudden it becomes a political issue. Same-sex marriage is not a political issue. It's a biblical issue. Transgenderism. I'm telling you, it's not a political issue. It is a biblical issue. But when the church stays silent and says, we just don't want to offend anybody, it becomes a political issue. Now, let me just say something here. That doesn't give any of us, any Christian, any time the right to be rude or offensive. You know what Paul said? The gospel will be offensive enough. Sometimes just teaching the truth of God's word is what's going to be offensive. We don't have to be offensive. I have always believed, and I won't be renewed to be known as a group of people that's known with a balance of grace and truth. But you know what? Let me show you what a statement that Jesus made, and it may be the most controversial statement that Jesus ever made, because it's not how we picture Jesus. But this is what Jesus said in Matthew 10:34. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. What does a sword do? A sword divides. A sword separates. And that's what truth does. It divides. It separates. It can set us free, but yet at the same time, it can also divide. So what we want to strive here for, we want to strive for a perfect balance of grace and truth. If you want to see a perfect balance of grace and truth, go to John chapter 9, where Jesus addressed the woman caught in adultery. And what did he say? Where are those who condemn you? Neither do I condemn you. But then he said this, that's grace. But go and sin no more. In other words, if you want your life to change, your behavior is going to have to change. So we're striving for that balance. Now let me just show you something in Luke chapter 2, verse 52. It's a familiar verse, and you've probably heard it before. Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor of God and men. You've heard that verse. But I want to go to the previous verse that precedes it, Luke 2, verse 51. Then he went down to Nazareth with them, that's his parents, and was obedient to them. It's interesting, this word obedient that's used here in Luke chapter 2 is the very same Greek word that's translated subject in Romans chapter 13. It means basically this: then he went down to Nazareth with them and was submissive to them without any questioning. That's Jesus. Now let me ask you a question. If Jesus was obedient, if he submitted to his parents without any question, does it kind of make sense that maybe we should do the same thing, right? Okay. I mean, this is a guy that never left his dirty socks on the floor, was a perfect kid, and yet he was submissive to us. Now, let me show you one other. So there's going to be longevity and stability. Here's a third benefit, just sensibility. Paul said this in Ephesians 6:1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. In other words, it's just common sense. It's just common sense. By the way, what's the difference between honoring and obeying? You obey your parents when you live at home. You honor your parents as you leave home. I'll give you an example. I was kind of an old school parent. I lived by this: my house, my rules. If you don't like the rules, you don't have to leave here. But if you live here, it's my rules. And you know what? By the way, I carried that on until my kids became adults. Because we all know if we have adult kids, eventually they are going to come back home, right? It's a fear we live with, but it happens. And sure enough, both my kids went through a stage. We want to build a new house, but we're going to sell our house, and we got about 4 or 5 months until the new house is done. So we come live with you. Happy to have you. But my house, my rules. I want you in by a certain, I don't want to be waking up at 1 o'clock in the morning, you coming in. So you need to be in by this time. Don't leave dirty dishes in the sink. You know I like a neat house. Don't leave things laying around, And so I had my rule. Like, if you want to live by the rules, but here's the funny one. My oldest son had 2 pugs, dogs. I said, I'd love to have you guys come. Dogs ain't coming. He said, what do you mean? I said, no, I don't like them. I don't want them in my house. He said, why not? They're dogs, they're so cute. I don't want their little nails scratching up my hardwood floors. I don't want yellow spots in my lawn. No, you're welcome. Grandkids love them. No dogs. Guess what? He got rid of the dogs. He found somehow he's too cheap to do something else, right? So push come to shove, he got rid of the dogs. But I'm getting, it was if you want to live in my house, it's my rules. Let me tell you something my kids never questioned. My kids never one time said, do I have to go to church tomorrow? They knew we got up on Sunday and went to church. And so I'm just saying, parents, they do live with you. You are taking care of them and supporting them. You get to set the rules. Now, that's part of obeying, but this is what you want to do. Think about this. When you obey, what happens? Now, this is good advice for the young people. When you obey, you know what happens? You build trust with your parents. As you build trust with your parents because you're being obedient to what they've asked you to do, guess what you get? You get more freedom. And eventually that relationship becomes less and less of a parent-child authority relationship. It becomes less adversarial to the point you're actually honoring your parents. So that when you leave, you honor them. But if you want to get to the place where you've positioned yourself to honor them, you have to learn to be obedient to them and live subject to their rules. I mean, we have 40 and 50-year-old adults who can't hold a job. You know somebody. There probably is somebody in your family. They just jump from job to job to job because they kind of live by nobody's going to tell me what to do. Nobody's going to be my boss. I'm telling you, it's because when they were early on, they didn't learn the principle of honor. So that's the difference between honor and obedience. Okay, here's the fourth benefit, tranquility. Colossians 3:20, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. It's just tranquility. It's that inner peace that comes for all of us in every area of our life when you just know you're doing life God's way. And God expects me to honor my parents and obey my parents, and I'm doing it. There's just a peace that naturally comes with it. So it's longevity, stability, sensibility, tranquility, great benefits. And God says to us time and time again, these things will be the result of our lives. They will actually determine the destiny of our life. But the key is honoring our parents by keeping this fifth commitment. So how do you honor your parents? Let me just give you some suggestions. You honor them by loving them. Now that sounds like a cheesy thing to say. How do you love your mom and dad? Because this is true at every stage of life. But let me just tell you what it's not. It's not saying I love you. That's easy. In fact, it's not an inclination. When you look at love, a biblical love, it's a demonstration. Listen to how Paul describes love in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4. Love is patient. It means long-tempered. It means you have a long fuse, not a short fuse. You ever heard somebody say you got a short fuse? This is the exact, you got a long fuse, opposite. Love is kind. It means free from petty criticism. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it is not rude, it's not self-seeking, it's not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Now, what do you read in those verses? Love is not. Love does not. In other words, when you love this way, the way Paul's talking about, you can't just say the words. It has to be demonstrated. It has to be expressed. You have to act on it. Let me show you an interesting passage. Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 1, verse 8. He said, then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus from Jerusalem and asked, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat. By the way, it is shocking to me to think that these disciples who were fishermen did not wash their hands before they ate. I mean, that's shocking to me, right? But Jesus replied, why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? For God said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. We looked at both of those verses. But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is, quote, devoted to God, they are not to honor their father or mother with it. In other words, I would help my parents, but I'm giving my money to God. But see, they actually weren't. But they would use that excuse. Thus, you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition, you hypocrites. And then it says this, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. What is Jesus saying? It's not about what you say. It's about what you do. It's about your attitude. It's about what's in your heart. You know, I don't know what parents, what you struggle with. It's easy to discipline actions. It's tough to deal with attitude, because that's where God has to step in and through his Spirit begin to work in the hearts of our children. In the same way, if we really love our parents, it's going to be demonstrated by our actions, by our attitudes. We're going to live it out in a tangible way. Here's the second one. You honor your parents by choosing to live under your parents' authority. You choose to live under their authority. And we just saw in Romans chapter 13, your parents are in your life, whether you like them or not. Your parents are in your life because God placed them in your life. He had a direct reason for placing them there. I'll say something about that in a minute, but you honor them. What would it look like to honor them? Well, you don't speak to your parents sarcastically. You don't speak to them flippantly. You don't roll your eyes, right? Heavy sighs. You know, that just sense of frustration. Body language. But when you're doing these things, you're beginning to live out this principle of honoring your commandment. By the way, I know that we can adjust our lives accordingly, because there's a family right back there, and they have shared with me. Chastity, where are you? Raise your hand. Raise your hand. She's the gatekeeper at the house. But a few weeks ago, when I taught do not use the Lord's name in vain, they took that seriously as a family. And so they started calling them out. If somebody said, oh God, or something like that, somebody yell, at Cassie would yell out, Third Amendment. She meant commandment, but I think it's so cute, right? Third Amendment. Third Amendment. Her mama said, I would hear from upstairs, Third Amendment. Third Amendment. But see, so you can hold each other accountable, and you can begin to work these things out in your life. And by the way, I told you, how many of you went home the week after that and you were aware of how many times people used God's name in vain around you, right? But once you're aware of it, you can actually, this is another one where you can change these things if you're aware of it, okay? But when you begin to do these things, you're beginning to live out the principle behind the commandment. Here's the third one. You honor your parents by valuing them. I mean, think about this. We're born dependent on our parents. Eventually, as kids, we become independent, and then after years, the years roll by, guess what? Our parents become dependent on us. But we have to value them at every stage. Here's the fourth one. Honor your parents by appreciating them. I came across this article published by USA Today. It says more than a third of elderly parents say their grown children have failed to help them in a time of need in the past 5 years. But when asked the question, only 16% of adults' children agreed. So there's a disconnect there. So how are we to show appreciation? Let me just give you some quick suggestions. For those of us who have older parents especially, make sure their needs are met. Make sure they have adequate food, clothing. I visited my dad on Monday, and he was still in bed, had the covers pulled up. I said, Dad, it's 9 o'clock. What are you doing in bed? He said, I don't have any pants. I said, what do you mean you don't have any pants? So I got up and started going through all of it. Not a pair of pants anywhere. So I called my sister, because she's real, you know how you got a sister, she does with this. I said, hey, we got a big issue here. Dad doesn't have any pants. And she just laughed. She said, what do you mean he doesn't have any pants? He has like 10 pairs of pants. I said, well, he doesn't have any pants. I can't find them. I've looked everywhere. She said, well, look in this drawer. I said, there's no pants. And she said, well, they took his laundry on Friday, and they were supposed to bring it back on Saturday. I said, you mean, Dad? So I said, Dad, have you been laying in bed since Friday because you don't have any pants? He said, yeah. So we had to get on that right away. We had to go find some pants, right? I'm down at the laundry and got his pants back for him and stuff. But see, crisis averted. But there are things like that that they will need. They'll need to go to the doctor. Before my dad was in the home he's living in, he needed to go to the doctor. I had a Corvette in those days. He wanted me to show up in the Corvette, put the top down, and go to the doctor. We just had a blast. I'll never forget, I took him to the eye doctor. And as he's walking in, the receptionist says, Mr. Lee, it's so good to see you. And they're chatting. And then she said, Mr. Lee, how long have you been married? And at this point, he said, 65 years. And she said, my parents will be married 65 years. And he said, yep, I'll tell you, that's enough. That's enough. Now, my dad made it 1 week shy of 75 years of marriage, right? But, you just invite here. So make sure their needs are met. Make sure they're basic necessity. Here's another. Include them in special days. I've noticed parents, older parents, they get excluded. It means so much to them when they're included. I don't know if you guys notice or remember, but if you were on Christmas Eve, and I didn't know my sister was doing this, my mom died the week before, and my sister brought my dad here on Christmas Eve. That meant the world to him to be able to do that. We just threw him a birthday party when he turned 96 last week. While they can, take them on trips. We grew up very, very poor. We never went on a vacation as a family. And that kind of extended my parents. And then I realized one day, my parents have never seen, my dad's the most patriotic person in the world. He'd never been to Washington, D.C. So one Monday after Easter, I got him in the car and we went and visited Washington, D.C. Found out they'd never been to Charleston. Me and my sister, that's what we gave them for Christmas. We took them to Charleston. We had a blast with them. They'd never seen New York City. And so we took them to New York City, went to the, out to see the Statue of Liberty, Empire State Building. They're big Duke fans. Duke was playing St. John in Madison Square Garden. We took them to the game that weekend. But you do those kinds of things for them. There's a little place up in Pennsylvania called Sound and Stage where they do Christian musicals and play. They're incredible. I took my parents up, got them in the car, went up there, went to Gettysburg. I think it was Samson. It was absolutely incredible. They had the time of their life. But here's the cool thing. When you're my age and you're taking your parents, I got there and I'm like, I feel like a teenager. I am so young compared to everybody's here for this big Christian musical, right? But see, there are some benefits for doing these things. Here's another one. Give them gifts. And I don't mean big gifts. A card. You know what really? A picture. A picture. Every time I go visit my dad, he said, see that picture up there? That's my wife. That's my wife. That's you and Shannon on those horses right there, right? Yeah. But it helps them with it. It helps them relive, and so it just speaks volume to them. But it's all a part of appreciating your parents. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Okay, Mike, great, appreciate all this. What if you had bad parents? What if you just had horrible parents? How do you honor dishonorable people? That's really what the question is. And here's the answer. It's a very simple answer. You choose to. You choose to. Regardless of how horrible your parents were, you choose to acknowledge maybe you don't know all that they had to endure when they were growing up. You choose to acknowledge maybe they were never Christians and they didn't live by the same value system that you discovered. But really what it comes down to this is you choose to forgive. You choose to forgive. After I did what I did, obviously it wreaked havoc in so many relationships, but one was my son, my grandkids. And Aaron brought the kids up from South Carolina, the first time I'd seen them since I did what I did. And I went and met them for lunch. And I was nervous. I mean, my stomach was knotted up. And we sat down, and the first thing I did, I just said, man, I sinned big time. And I did something I never thought I did, and I need to ask your forgiveness. And my 15-year-old granddaughter said, of course we forgive you, Grandpa. We don't like it, but we certainly forgive you. But here's the thing, they've lived that out. They've lived that out. By the way, you know what that's an indication of? Good parenting. Because Aaron, who could have carried that torch, like, look what Dad did. He sat down with him. He says, guys, this is what the Bible teaches, and this is what we do. We forgive. And they've not only treated me, they've treated Shannon with such respect. In fact, one time they were here visiting, and Ambry, she's my little spark plug 8-year-old granddaughter. She looked at Shannon one day. She said, I guess this makes you my step-grandma. I said, call her grandma. Every time you see her, you call her grandma, right? But Now, forgiveness. I realize when we talk about the subject of forgiveness, it is a big time, all-encompassing, involved subject. But this is what the Bible teaches about forgiveness. Ephesians 4:26. And we're going to say more about this next weekend when we talk about don't murder. And you better all be here for that one. Okay, 4:26. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry. In other words, it's okay to be angry. Even God's angry. It's a God-given emotion. It's okay to be angry because you've been hurt. But it's not okay to carry your hurt and anger around for so long that it begins to affect your actions and your attitude and your behavior and your words. So Paul says to avoid that, deal with your anger as soon as possible. And he says by the time the sun goes down. I think that's a great principle. I don't know if he meant that figuratively or literally. I think he was just saying deal with it in a timely manner because, as I said, if you lived in Alaska, you could be angry all spring. You're like, I got 3 more months to be angry. Let me just hang on to this for a while. But I think the point is clear. What he's saying is deal with it quickly. Even as a couple and stuff, you don't want to go to bed like that. Don't you want to resolve it so you can get a good night's sleep and you wake up tomorrow and it's a clean slate, right? Deal with it quickly. Don't carry around unresolved anger. And then he tells us why in the very next verse, Ephesians 4:27, do not give the devil a foothold. And what he's saying is this: if you have an unforgiving spirit, if you're angering in your heart, harboring anger and resentment, you're giving Satan a foothold. Literally, the Greek word is stronghold in your life. And I can tell you, as you hold on to that anger, this is what you're going to do. You're going to carry it with you into every one of your relationships. And eventually, it will surface. Now, here's the good news. The good news is that it can be the anger can be released. You can be set free from it. You can like, you know what this word forgive actually means in the Bible? The word forgive means this: to send away, to be done with. Just send it away. Be done with it. Isn't that a great word? So my encouragement is, if you're holding on to anger and hurt and unforgiveness, let this be the day that you just send it away. But here's the thing: you can choose to do that. And I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, Mike, you don't know what I've been through. It's easy for you to sit up there and say that, but you don't get it. And I understand there could have been physical abuse. There could have been sexual abuse. Maybe there was abuse because there was drugs in your home. There was drug addictions and alcoholism and all of those different things. And if that's the case, you're right. I never had to experience that. I was never abused by my parents, but I will tell you this: I'm a human being, and I know what it feels like to be hurt. I certainly know what it feels like to be betrayed. And I know what it feels like to carry around all that anger. I mean, when I went through what I went through, I did what I did, and I wreaked havoc. And I told you I deal with the consequences of that every day. But I'm going to tell you something. There are a lot of people who use that against me. And there was a lot of vindictiveness, a lot of punitive danger. There was a lot of retribution in very, very tangible ways. And by the way, these are from people who were in authority over me. But then one night when I couldn't sleep because this was going around in my mind, you know how that is? I felt like God said, okay, Mike, here's the deal. What could they possibly do to undo it? And when you think what people have done to you in the past and you're hanging on to it, think about that. What can they do to undo it? And I think for the first time, it hit me what Jesus was saying in Matthew chapter 18 when he used the picture. He said, you got to cancel the debt. In other words, they have created a debt in your life where you feel like they owe me this. You got to get to the point where you think they really can't repay it. The damage that's been done, they can't undo. So technically, realistically, all you can do is just cancel the debt. So I remember laying in bed that night just deciding, okay, I'm going to cancel the debt. Because understand, it's a decision. It's not an emotion. So I'm going to send it away. And what? I stood up here today a free man. And I'm believing that you can walk out of here today free. You see, forgiveness isn't for the parents that hurt you. And you're not letting them off the hook by forgiving them. Forgiveness just allows you to cut the chain from the past, to move past the anger and destroy it, and because it will destroy you if you don't do it. And God knows it so well, he says, you got to forgive. You must forgive. You have to, for your sake. And if you will, you'll be free. So kind of think of it this way. In your mind is a gallery of pictures. All put together in high definition. And my guess is for a lot of us, because of father and mother wounds, there are pictures there that include your relationship with your parents. Some of them are obscene. Some of them are maybe violent. Some of them are incredibly hurtful. But here's the thing, they have no business being the art gallery of your mind. So this is what you do. And I think this is what God is saying to you this weekend. Go back to that art gallery one last time. Walk down that hallway. Take down those painful pictures and look at them for the last time, and then destroy them. How do you destroy them? You destroy them by forgiving the person that's living in that frame. But until you do, I'm telling you, those pictures will haunt you, and they will drain you, and they will take away your energy, your joy, and your freedom. You say, Dad, I forgive you. Mom, I forgive you. Those words can change your life. Now, let me just say something here. Doesn't mean your relationship's going to be restored. Doesn't mean it's going to get, listen, for some of you, you're still angry at your parents who are deceased. What are they going to do about it? But what you can do is you can release it. You can send it away. And you can be free. I want us just to bow our heads for a second. And I'm going to pray. You know, sometimes people will ask me the question, when I'm talking with them about a situation in their family, they're like, why did God ever put me in this hole? Well, I want you to understand, many, many times, God doesn't necessarily put us in a situation, but God will give us the grace and the strength that takes us through the situation. And if we claim that grace and strength, and because of the growth that's going to come when we're going through that situation, what you may realize is going to uniquely gift you and position you to deal with people that you come across in your life that you would have never been able to minister to otherwise. You're going to come across someone who has a similar situation to you, but because you found freedom and healing, God has now positioned you to speak wisdom and truth and love into their life and help them find that freedom. There are principles at times, even if you don't understand them, if you can just come to the conclusion that, you know what, this is God's word, so I'm going to obey this commandment. I'm going to try to live out this principle. I'm telling you, if you can get there, I promise you this, there will be fruit on the other side. So let's just think about this principle of honor. God specifically teaches us this principle through our parents. But I know that for some of you sitting here, that hasn't been an easy road. Some of your parents, as I said, may not have even been believers, and your parents were just absolutely horrible, did horrible things. Part of the way you honor them is just to realize they're fallen, they're broken. But you have to forgive. But that's your choice. Father, thank you for providing healing. You are the miracle worker, the way maker. And for those that are here right now and the battle is raging inside of them, I pray that they will just walk out of here free because they chose to take the abuse, the hurt, the disrespect, and send it away. And Father, there may be some parents here who are harboring those same kind of feelings toward their kids. Maybe they haven't met our expectations. Maybe they haven't been honoring. Maybe there's an anger that's built. So for those of us who are in that role, Father, may we release, may we set it free. Do what we can to restore and reconcile, but cancel the debt. But Father, I hope that we'll walk out of the door and walk back in this door next week a little lighter, a little less burdened, as we find peace and work through this, and maybe even reaching out to a parent and saying, we need to have a talk. We need to have a talk. And maybe if there's barriers, maybe barriers need to stay up, but maybe one little barrier could be removed, maybe a phone call or a card. And then maybe in a safe environment, a conversation one day. But Father, we know that your goal is always restoration, not always possible. But whenever we can make it happen, give us the grace and desire to make it happen. And we're going to honor you because you're an awesome God. You're an awesome God, and you went to incredible lengths to restore our relationship with you. And we thank you for that. In your name we pray.